Each year at the Harlington Air Show in Texas, it's always the flying fortress that the crowds look for. Steeped in tradition, the Boeing B-17 is more a legend than just an aircraft. But the legend is as much about men as it is about the fortress. Men of vision and men of courage. The first of the men of vision in this story was General Billy Mitchell. His experience in the First World War convinced him that air power was the only way to protect America in any future war, and further, that the winner of such a conflict would be determined on the basis of superior air power. Because this would involve the bombing of naval targets, his new ideas brought him into conflict with the Navy and the administration, and eventually cost him his career. But not before he'd proved his point on the captured German battleship, the Ostfriesland. From 1930, staggeringly swift advances in bomber design became the norm, with the frail biplane technology of World War I swept aside by new metal monoplanes, starting with Boeing's B-9. But funds for military aircraft were always low, and the role of a bomber in an America committed to peace was hard to see, especially as the Navy had by now well asserted its responsibility for dealing with any enemy ships at sea. The inter-service rivalry of this era was to have a continuing influence on the development of the bomber throughout the 30s, though clearly some bomber force had to exist, even if only of token strength. The career of the B-9 was short, replaced by the B-10, which itself marked another huge step forward in design. But apart from exercises, the only action they saw was in use against the effects of natural disasters, like airdrops to the victims of floods. In this, they did provide a unique service, and with the Air Corps always keen to demonstrate its usefulness to the public, they were rapidly on hand wherever disaster occurred. In 1933, one major breakthrough did happen. The Army postulated a plane to carry a ton of bombs for 5,000 miles, and Boeing won a contract to design just one enormous bomber, the XB-15. This plane, it was hoped, would have enough range to attack not enemy fleets, but enemy countries, overseas. Thus, there was no conflict with the Navy. Because of its size, the XB-15 was not completed until 1937, and although it saw considerable service as the C-105, a military transport, it really was more of a guinea pig to explore the theory of extra-long-range bombing. And with the Army backing the project, the engineers were able to develop technologies that were to stand both Boeing and the US in good stead in the years to come. First to benefit was Pan American Airways, who needed long range for its commercial flying boats. And Boeing quickly adapted the XB-15's wing and other various parts to make what was, for many years, the largest airliner in production, the Clipper. This idea was successful, and Boeing gained more experience with large planes. A seaplane of a different sort also appeared. Modified from the B-10 and ostensibly for coastal patrol, the B-12AM project, backed by General Andrews, raised the ever-alert eyebrows of the Navy yet again. Early in 1934, the Army called for designs to be prepared to replace the B-10 with a plane that had roughly twice its bomb load and range. With the decision to be made on the basis of a competition between prototypes produced at the manufacturer's expense, Boeing, short of cash, faced a dilemma. They had the advantage of the B-15's already designed and tested wing, which could be scaled down, though this locked the plane into a four-engined format in the face of the common perception that such planes were, in addition to their expense, difficult to fly. Incorporating features of their successful airliner, the Model 247, as well as exploiting advances made in developing the XB-15, their plane was to prove, however, to be relatively easy to handle, with the extra power being used not to increase the size of the plane, but to increase its performance. Through a long series of tests, the specifications were refined to what was to be the Boeing Model 299. Gambling on the advantage its design gave it over its rivals, the company proceeded, with borrowed cash, to build the plane. Conditions of strict secrecy were enforced for fear of industrial espionage. Holding the design advantage, Boeing had no desire to reveal their triumph prematurely. The plane took 11 months to build. On the 1st of July 1935, the mystery ship was wheeled out of its construction hangar, and immediately it was apparent that this was the most advanced bomber yet built. Capable of carrying 2.5 tons of bombs 2,000 miles at over 200 miles per hour, armed with 5 machine guns, she was clearly representative of a new generation. On the 28th, she took to the air for the first time. The claim, "We've got a winner," was one that, with some justification, the Boeing company had made before. By the time the 299 landed after her first flight, it was evident that, on this occasion, it was an understatement. On August the 20th, 1935, she was back in the air for the flight to Dayton for the competition, and completed the 2,000-mile journey in the then astonishing time of 9 hours, which was faster than any of the Army's fighters of the day could manage. Notwithstanding the worry this must have caused about the performance of their pursuit planes, the Air Corps was pleasantly excited by Boeing's big new bomber. The other 2 prototypes in the competition were both modifications of existing planes. Martin's B-12 was in fact a variant of the B-10, and Douglas's B-18 was based on its successful DC-2 airliner. Both were dwarfed by the 299. The B-18, sharing the DC-2's sturdiness, plodded reliably into history. By the time conflict came, she'd clearly been superseded, and, modified as an anti-submarine aircraft, she spent the war patrolling the US coasts. As the competition commenced, the Model 299 was redesignated the B-17, and as the trials continued, with the top brass looking on, she proceeded to surpass all the specifications the Army had set. Then came disaster. Before takeoff, the pilot had omitted to release the locks on the control surfaces, and the plane ploughed into the ground. Through no fault of the design, the 299 was unable to complete the tests as there was no backup plane available. In the furore that followed, despite the pleading of the Air Corps that they wanted the B-17 regardless of the crash, the service chiefs intervened, and almost by default, the majority of the orders for new aircraft went to the B-18. The pleading of the Air Corps did, however, see an order placed for 13 Boeings, to be known as YB-17s. The engineers went literally back to the drawing board, and the new planes incorporated extensive modifications. Again, it took 11 months to produce the first plane, and by then it was 7 foot longer and 1 ton heavier than the 299 had been. With such a small production run, the new aircraft were virtually handmade, modern technology being coaxed together with manpower and methods perhaps more appropriate for building buggies. From the moment the Army first got its hands on the fortresses, they kept the planes very busy. General Andrews was determined to show them off, to win public support for an expansion of the Air Corps. In May 1938, General Andrews, perhaps as a challenge to the prevailing views, perhaps simply as a publicity stunt, had his B-17s intercept the Italian liner the Rex when she was 800 miles out to sea. The interception was a great success, so much so that the Navy, infuriated at the intrusion into its realm, had directives made that limited the Air Corps to operations within 100 miles of the coast. The incident also cost General Andrews his job. The chief navigator on the flight to intercept the Rex was another man who was to greatly influence not only the B-17 story, but indeed the successful implementation of the whole theory of strategic bombing, Curtis LeMay. Meanwhile, the evolution of the B-17 had continued with the B-17B, 3,000 pounds heavier, 40 miles per hour faster than the YBs, with different armament and other modifications. She reflects the constant change and development that the B-17 was to undergo throughout its production life. Importantly, her engines were now supercharged, allowing greater speed and sealing. With the Luftwaffe's crushing of Poland in the opening phase of the war, all reservations about the concept of the big bomber were set aside. The first fortresses to see action, B-17Cs and Ds, were those provided to Britain, where they were called Fortress 1. But the early British experience was very unsatisfactory, highlighting, among other things, the lack of effective rear armament. Boeing's engineers had foreseen some of the British criticism, and the B-17E, which they had developed, preempted many of the design changes that combat had shown were desirable. It also incorporated the reshaped tail. The E was so extensively redesigned that it was almost a new plane, displaying the distinctive lines of the classic B-17. The Fortress was now bristling with 50mm machine guns, not only from the new tail position, but with waist guns, upper turret, ball turret below and more guns in the front of the plane. Theoretically, she could defend herself against all comers. But only the earlier shape was available when the US was pulled into World War II by the events at Pearl Harbor. Suddenly, demand for the 17 was great. The plane many did not want before was now vital. Production was reorganized and factories mechanized as America turned to the war effort. With the workforce distorted by the call of the military, for the first time, huge numbers of American women took the load in the manufacture of US armaments. To work in confined areas, aircraft manufacturers deliberately hired little people. With the automation of so many processes that had previously been exactingly carried out by hand, the scale and speed of production reached levels that would have been inconceivable only a few years before. At the peak of B-17 production, the three companies involved in building them were turning out 130 per week, with Boeing's Seattle plant producing 16 per day. As fast as they were turned over to the Army, they were sent into action. For most B-17s, going to war meant going first to England, to join the strategic bombing offensive against Nazi Germany. ground crews worked ceaselessly on the fortresses, readying them for their missions over enemy territory, ensuring that the planes gave their crews the best possible chances of success and survival. With the great height that the missions were flown at, the crews needed special clothing to help combat the extreme cold. As preparations for a raid continue, bombs are loaded into the bomb bays. Guns are armed with freshly unpacked ammunition belts. Each man readies himself and his equipment. The plane comes to life with the business of war, and the men talk among themselves, trading stories and information about their jobs. The pilots engage in last-minute discussions with the ground liaison officers. Another essential garment for the gunners. Cumbersome and ungainly, the flak jacket, an investment in human lives. The throat microphone made for uncomfortable vital communications, especially when teamed with the oxygen mask. And the mission was away. Flying towards Germany, weighed down by their bomb loads, the B-17's gunners have an all-important role. Their alertness and skill is the plane's only protection. Without effective radar triangulation, the early phases of the bombing offensive relied upon the navigators. The British nighttime operations had earlier failed to refine their navigation, and specific targets had been abandoned in favor of area bombing. The US, however, bombing by day, threw responsibility onto the navigators and persisted with specific attacks. It soon became evident that the expectation that the fortresses could fight their way to their targets and back were wildly optimistic. What had not been realized was that for a strategic air offensive to succeed, the prerequisite is control of the air. The British had mastered their airspace during the Battle of Britain and repulsed the Luftwaffe. But, similarly, without effective long-range fighter protection for the attacking bombers, this air offensive faced similar defeat. The Germans controlled their airspace, and their fighters cut swathes through the massed fortresses, leading to several pauses in the campaign and to fears that the whole concept would have to be abandoned. On many missions, whole squadrons were annihilated as the losses grew to staggering proportions. Many more men owed their lives to the almost incredible ability of the B-17 to absorb damage and continue flying, no matter how roughly. Many planes that made it back did so in conditions such that they were scrapped, but their crews still owed them their lives. With varying effectiveness, 4 counters to the German dominance were developed. Firstly, under the direction of Curtis LeMay, radical changes were made to the formations that the fortresses flew, tightening them and grouping the planes to provide more effective mutual protection. By the time these formations were pulled tightly together, they concentrated 500 50mm machine guns in a hedgehog of firepower that, so long as the formation held close, made life for the enemy fighter pilots much more difficult and dangerous. The close box formation was very demanding of pilots and very tiring, and the risks of collision and of shooting one another down were increased. But it did, to a certain extent, work. Having the massed guns of the fortresses operating in concert certainly meant that the enemy losses were much higher. In fact, it is probable that the B-17s shot down more enemy aircraft over Europe during the war than all other US aeroplanes combined, making their gunners the unsung aces of the conflict. The second change made was the incorporation of an effective forward-facing gun turret. This chin turret was first added by the Douglas Company to fortresses it built, as a result of criticism that the plane was being routinely dealt with by the Luftwaffe attacking from straight on. it proved an instant success and was incorporated into all later B-17Fs and to the B-17G. The third development was the B-40, a modified B-17 for use as an escort gunship, with power-operated twin 50s in the side and an extra turret above. Unlike the normal bombers, this plane was crammed with ammunition for its guns. However, this made it very heavy, and after the other B-17s dropped their bombs, they were lighter and faster than the escort plane. Though it did have enormous firepower, as escorts the planes were only marginally successful. Most of them were developed and built by Lockheed Vega, who by now were one of the 3 companies building B-17s. But the battle was, in reality, a battle for control of the air, and the most effective way to win that control was to develop long-range fighter escort aircraft. Aircraft like the P-47 Thunderbolt, which, fitted with drop tanks, made the Allies' first serious attempt at providing fighter protection for the bombers. Also tried was the twin-engined P-38 Lightning. But the first to be effective, and probably overall the plane that turned the battle, was the famous P-51 Mustang. But all 3 of these planes played some part, all having long range, high maneuverability and heavy firepower. They became known as the bomber's little friends. Until after D-Day they could take off from airfields in France, all of the escorts relied upon drop tanks for the extra fuel they needed. These tanks were jettisoned, either when empty or when the plane needed to be unencumbered to go into combat with the enemy. For most of the war, however, even with drop tanks, US fighter pilots were able to sweep the air of enemy fighters only for the first part of bomber missions. For the last part of the run, the 17s were on their own, and after the fighters finally had to turn back, they had only LeMay's tactics, the gunner's skill, and luck to protect them. Almost as deadly as the enemy fighters, in terms of overall losses of fortresses during the war, was the German flak. Unfortunately, the LeMay formations, which were effective against the fighters, only presented the flak gunners with fat, juicy, massed targets, and there was no defense against them. The final approach was always the worst point of the mission, as the plane was locked into the bomb site on a form of automatic pilot and guided by the bombardier. It was impossible to change course, and luck became their only ally. Eventually, their bombing campaigns were to be one of the deciding factors of the war, much as the planners had originally thought, as they crippled Germany's war production and devastated her transportation systems. They even served their own ends too, in that the German petrol shortages became so severe that the Luftwaffe eventually was hard-pressed to keep what few planes it still had in the air to fight them. Here is what the mission was all about, what the B-17 was all about, the bomb drop. Lighter and faster without their bombs, the returning 17s were still prey for German day fighters, with only the gunners for protection.
There's 4 of them, 1 o'clock high.
They're coming around. Watch.
Too fast, 6 o'clock up, coming in, diving at you.
B-17 in trouble out of 2 o'clock, watching.
Got an engine on fire.
Despite the efforts of the gunners, for very many planes, the protection they could give was ineffective against the excellent German fighters.
3 planes, 9 o'clock, coming around. Keep your eye on them, boy.
Because of the weight of the ammunition, the bombers normally took off with about 500 rounds per gun, slightly more for the rear gunner. This meant that there was about enough ammunition for the gunners to fire for 1 minute.
B-17, Chuck, 3 o'clock. Motor smoking. Fire at 10:30, coming around. 10:30 upper or lower?
B-17 out of control at 3 o'clock.
Come on, you guys, get out of that plane. Bail out. There's one. He come out of the bomb bay.
Yeah, I see him.
Even badly damaged, the strength of the B-17s often brought them home. Perhaps the 17's greatest asset was its ability to take the flak and survive. Not all B-17 damage was caused by the enemy. The close box formation caused some collisions. Here, hell and high water has survived being hit by another B-17. The tail gunner, a very lucky man, also survived, having just left his position to check the tail wheel before the crash. Many B-17s that struggled back too damaged to be repaired were used to cobble together composite planes, patchwork bombers, to help make up the heavy losses. Another use to which tired B-17s, too old for refurbishment, were put was as radio-controlled flying bombs, packed with 22,000 pounds of explosive and controlled from a parent plane, or, in this test, from the ground. More successful was their use as launch platforms for guided bombs. During the war, the US obtained unexploded German V-1 flying bombs, and, although they were never used, the US experimented with its own versions. Some launched from ground ramps, but more often, to obtain maximum range, from B-17s. While the Fortress is most often associated with the European theatre, it saw much service in the Pacific. In fact, it was the only four-engined bomber on hand when war broke out. The 17 saw service at Midway, Rabaul, and in countless other attacks against the Japanese, who, like Germany, really did not have an equivalent in range, lifting capacity, or versatility. This remarkable footage shows a practice attack by a B-17 at extremely low altitude. This in a plane that was specifically designed for high-altitude flying. The vast expanses of the Pacific, however, required more range than the Fortresses could offer, and soon B-24 Liberators, which had still greater range and fully automatic pilots, were to take over much of the heavy bomber role in the Pacific. The Allied commander in the Pacific, General Douglas MacArthur, who was ultimately to accept the Japanese surrender, used several specially converted B-17s as his transport. Here, under the watchful eyes of his aides and military police, the general's luggage and doubtless top-secret information is being loaded aboard one of his personal planes. The transport application of Model 299 was actually considered well before the war, when Boeing used its wing and tailplane in its Stratoliner. This, the first pressurized transport aircraft ever built, was to use a new fuselage, but in most other ways was a B-17. Many saw service throughout the war, where their four engines helped them cross the Atlantic with little fear of attack. No Stratoliners were produced during the war, as Boeing's main Seattle plant, like that of several other manufacturers, was committed to Fortress production. The pre-war lessons Boeing had learned from the pressurized high-flying Stratoliner was still to be used in the war effort, but in a different plane. Even before the war, Boeing and the Army were testing the effects of pressurization on crew and aircraft, because a totally new bomber was on the way. This plane, the B-29, would fly much higher and further than the B-17, and pressurization offered the only alternative to the uncomfortable and restricting oxygen mask. The B-29 Superfortress was a new generation of bomber, able to bridge the Pacific that had previously protected Japan from effective Allied bombardment. Thousands were built, but it took only 2 to bring the war to an end, using new tools of destruction with unprecedented power. With such sophistication available to the Army Air Force, it would seem unlikely that there would be any role at all for the by now venerable B-17 to play in the post-war years. But not so. Here again, Curtis LeMay, now a General and Deputy Chief of the Air Staff for Research and Development, is about to observe the use of atomic weapons against naval targets in a test that is a far cry from intercepting the wrecks in the pre-war YB-17s. The drop will, of course, be made by a B-29 at a test site in the Pacific, but its effects are not predictable, and much information on this new type of weapon remains to be gathered. As the Superfortress's pilot and crew make their preparations for the bomb drop, other preparations are being made back at base. A converted drone B-17, much modified and completely radio-controlled from the ground, takes off. Once in the air, another B-17, refitted as a mothership and carrying airborne radio controllers, will direct the drones to the test site. The drones and the mothership approach the outer edge of the test area, where scores of surplus naval vessels are to be sacrificed in the explosion. The B-29 makes its final approach over the target, and the bomb aimer adjusts his sight. While miles away, naval crews prepare to watch a new kind of terror. Seconds after the shockwave, the mother plane directs the drones into the atomic cloud, through which they fly, gathering data and samples in special collectors. The remotely controlled drones can go where no manned aircraft can safely venture, into the radioactive aftermath of the test. The drones are returned to base, and the mother plane hands over to ground control for landing. Once down, the drones are carefully tended by specially trained crew, who remove the samples collected by what is now a very contaminated aeroplane. The samples are dispatched, and the aircraft given a thorough hosing down with special equipment. The radio-controlled drone could hardly have been envisaged by the designers of the Model 299. Hardly had the West obtained a monopoly on atomic warfare than it was lost. And thus began another war, the Cold War. From the 50s on, the United States was to constantly watch for Soviet aircraft which could bring devastation to America, with ground-to-air missiles ever ready to answer the bomber's threat. Ground-to-air tactics had to be tested, and again the pilotless B-17 drone was used. Here, the controller, in the mother plane, watches a television screen, showing the cockpit of a drone that is about to be sacrificed to demonstrate ground-to-air efficiency. In this, the Fortress's last service role, many of the B-17s were shot down with the Boeing, one of the most successful ground-to-air missiles, and, perhaps ironically, perhaps fittingly, also built by Boeing. It may seem sad to think that the Fortresses were used as disposable items after the war, but they had been designed strictly as bombers, and their cramped interiors did not lend themselves to peacetime purposes. So, being superseded as military tools, at the end of the World War, most of them were simply scrapped. Perhaps this was an ignominious end, but perhaps it was fitting. After all, they had done what they were designed to do, and done it well. They had been produced in great numbers. More than 12,000 had been made, and they'd borne the brunt of terrible losses, with over 5,000 destroyed in combat. They had been so important that enormous production capacity had been devoted to them, with 3 aircraft manufacturers building them, with their motors being made by 2 companies, including Studebaker, with the farming equipment manufacturer Alice Chalmers turning their plant to making superchargers for them, and with a brassiere manufacturer making nacelles for their engines. The job they did, especially over Europe, helped make the war winnable, and the design breakthroughs involved in their development live on in civil and military aircraft of newer generations. The few that still fly are treasures, not just because of the memories, but because they are, with their grace and power, still great planes.